Hi there, my front-end friends. Did you know I've been making YouTube videos for about 6.5 years now? I'm pretty sure that's longer than I ever had any single job. And while my production quality might have improved a little bit since then, one thing that has been a constant is if I use a CSS property that has come out since CSS2 is released, someone will be very helpful and go and make a comment about how browser support for that property or that feature is not very good. The thing is, a lot of the features that people are actually telling me don't have the best browser support have better browser support than they might realize. So today, I want to take a look at a bunch of CSS properties that probably have better browser support than you realize. So for this, we're going to be using Can I Use, which is a fantastic resource for having a rough idea of what the browser support for something is, though there are a few little caveats with the information here that I'll address a little bit later on. And these are all things that I've talked a lot about in detail, such as custom properties, where I actually have like a several part series on them, and I have at least a video on everything in here, I believe, that we'll be taking a look at. So there'll be plenty of links down below if you want to learn more about any of these, and I will be showing quick examples for things that I think people are less familiar with. And I'm starting with custom properties, not because people tell me they have bad browser support anymore, or at least it's been a little while, but to sort of use this as a baseline, because it's one of those things that I think people are using just regularly now. As we can see right there, actually, right up there, we're sitting about 96% if you include the prefixing, or either way, the prefix isn't counting for very much. But yeah, they're super well supported, and I think that should act as a nice baseline for the different features we'll be looking at. And the next one of these is object fit. And if you don't know what object fit is, it's a little bit with images. It's a hard one to describe, so we'll look at an example. But this one's actually at 97%, which might seem a little bit weird considering the custom properties was at 96, and I still get people questioning me on this. And I think one of the issues is sometimes it's a little bit funky how it works. But just as a really quick thing, if you might have images that are different sizes coming in, so this chair image is different from all my other ones, I could throw something like this on it where I'm setting an explicit height and width. The problem now is it's stretching my images, so we come in with an object fit of cover, and it's just like a background size, and then it will crop the images to fit within that space instead of stretching them just like a background size of cover would work. This is insanely useful. I use it all the time now, and I can be pretty safe in using it because we can see how amazing the support for it is. Basically, it's just not Internet Explorer. We'll address Internet Explorer in a little bit when we actually address a few other browsers as well that can be considered problematic. The next one up is WebP image format, which is also sitting there at 96%, with Internet Explorer basically being the only thing that does not support it. Though there are some issues around older versions of Safari because it does need to be on a certain operating system as well to be able to have it supported. So that is a little bit of a caveat there. It's probably still safer if you're using WebP to offer alternatives like a JPEG as well as a fallback. You can do that using the picture element. I've also talked about that before, so you can check that out. But the other thing here is we can look at the AVIF, which is another generally better version or better image format. And this one's at 83%, which is actually really good. And it tends to be better, though sometimes WebP can get better results. It depends on the image, but AVIF I think tends to be the better one. Another one I want to look at is intrinsic and extrinsic sizing, which is at 96% as well. This is one of those ones where you probably don't want to use it all the time. But it could be useful in an example like this one where, say, you have titles and you need the background to match the size of the title. Well, I can just throw a width of fit content on there and then it fits the content. And it's super good, but the advantage with this is also when it wraps, that it will wrap properly and we don't run into any issues with it. There's also the min content and max content, which will be the minimum possible size for them, and max means no line wrapping. So max content I don't see used too often because it will cause overflows, but they all can be a little bit useful. But fit content is nice for just these types of things. And you might be going, well, I could change the block for an inline and get the same result, right? If I turn that off, but that's not really true because then my padding's not calculated and it throws off the spacing. Or I could do an inline block and then it actually changes how the collapsing margins work. So now my spacing's thrown off again. So, I could just not do that and do a width of fit content. And I think it's a little bit more consistent and a little bit easier to understand how it's working. So just a quick rundown there, but there's better use cases for this as well. So again, I have linked to examples and all of that in some other videos. Here, grid, I still get people talking about grid. I use it all the time. I absolutely love grid. It's a lot less. This is one of the ones that I've probably got comments the most about early on. that have quieted down a little bit, but grid also at over 96%. All of these are basically the same, right? And just to compare, Flexbox is something everybody uses. It is at 98%, though again, there is a caveat with this information. But I will throw that out there that, you know, they're basically on par, because that we'll talk, as I said, about that 2% in a little bit. Another one is conic gradients. People, I just think they're used to linear gradients and used to using radial gradients. They're not used to using conic gradients, even though they have fantastic support and they're really cool. But if we come and take a look, just in case you're not familiar, this is gradient.style by Adam Argyle. I'm sure you're used to gradients like this, your radial gradient. And then we have the conic gradient that spins like from a point and goes around and then ends at the other color. It might seem a little bit weird. Why would you want to do that? But you can do like pie chart type stuff with it, especially if the parent had a border radius to make it a circle. You can also do interesting things like this because you just loop back to the starting color and then you don't get that solid line. You can do really interesting things. You can make super nice gradients with conic gradients, and you can also do crazy patterns with them as well. They're really, really powerful. And if they're not part of your repertoire, I think it's probably pretty safe to add them in there these days. Another feature that has really good browser support is logical properties. And this I think people don't use a lot. I don't know if people don't use these just because they're not familiar with them or because it's faster sometimes to use the non-logical one, because you could do a width or you could do an inline size. So inline size is obviously longer to write. So I think people avoid it for certain reasons like that. But you could do like a margin left and a margin right by using a margin inline. There is a bit of a difference, whereas if the writing mode was changed, that would change with it. But definitely, I think logical properties are going to slowly become the norm. And if you're not used to them, at least learn a little bit about them. But if you're doing any multilingual websites, 100% look it up, watch the video I've linked below, look up the MDM article, whatever it is, but you'll definitely be wanting to use them. So definitely logical properties they're definitely, I'm convinced they will become the normal, and with the browser support being this good, there's no reason not really to use them anymore. And this is, I will say, where sort of my cutoff where the numbers we're getting are about 95%. And we're going to start entering into a realm with less supported features. This is the is selector, which is still up there. And is lets you group things. The only thing with this is you'll see that there's like some older versions of it that it mentions here. So we're sort of dropping more into like the 92%, 93% range. So it isn't quite as well supported. But is basically lets you group selectors instead of having like these long comma separated lists. It's a lot easier to do. And it combines a lot with the where selector, and the where selector didn't have previous versions. This is like the specificity killer. Anything within where gets 0 specificity, super useful. You might want to be cautious when using it depending on what your audience is. For me on my own site, I could probably use it safely because everybody visiting my site are generally going to be developers. So they're going to be on up-to-date modern browsers. But if I had to worry about people on older devices and other stuff, you know, maybe there's a little caution that should be thrown to the wind once we start getting into these lower numbers. Now, one feature that people remind me about all the time still is when I use gap with Flexbox. And I guess in a way it is at 92%. Whereas if you just look up gap, you'll see about 95% because that's about the same as grid, or probably is the same as grid support, since that's, I think, what that number is looking at. Because here, yeah, we can see it matches the number there. And so the main culprit here is older versions of iOS. It is like 0.44%. So that's sort of the culprit and tends to be the main culprit because it's people on, or I should be looking at iOS, sorry. It's almost 1%. So this is where people on old iOS devices can't update their browser and they're sort of stuck on these older ones. And of course, this can happen not only on iOS, it happens with Android devices as well, where you can't always update, but Safari really locks things down. And the problem also with iOS is every browser on iOS is running WebKit. So they're just basically skins of Safari, you know, Chrome, Firefox, whatever you're using, it's just Safari under the hood. So it's a little bit more limiting, and it is one of those things, again, that you should probably take into account depending on your audience. But the support is probably better than some people realize at this point. One thing that actually might have worse support than people realize is aspect ratio, which is around 92%. Because no one ever questions me when I use this. I get so many comments when I use gap, but if I use an aspect ratio, it just goes by like, sure, aspect ratio. Fine, and it's super useful because here, instead of setting when I did the width and the height here, I could just do instead of setting a height, I could do an aspect ratio of like 16/9. And it's going to figure out the height based on the width and set it to 16/9. And with the object fit cover there, it's just magical, right? Or, I wouldn't normally do this, but we could do a 9/16 if we needed to, just to show you a little bit of how it's working right there. But yeah, just to say that it's interesting. Sometimes people just assume, I think, some of these work really well and some don't. Now, the one difference I would say between using something like an aspect ratio over gap is if gap doesn't work, it could potentially break your layout a little bit. Whereas if aspect ratio didn't work, the images, it might not look as pretty, but it probably wouldn't cause the same layout issues that you might run into gap not working. So just to throw that out there, it's a little bit about what I want to talk about here is also like what happens when these features don't work and how important is it if they work or they don't work. And I'm going to talk more about that as we go through. Now, moving on, next we have Cascade layers, which I won't lie, I haven't used a ton of, though I have covered them, and I do think that they're going to start being something we see popping up more and more, especially within different frameworks and stuff, where it basically just allows you to set like layers of CSS that control your specificity a little bit. So you could have a base layer that could have the highest specificity you want to have, and then a layer underneath that one that is just using an element selector, and because it's in a higher priority layer, that will actually have precedence over even like an ID selector or something in the base layer, and it can be a nice way to organize your CSS. Up next we have has, and I think has been one of those things that has gotten a lot of hype lately. And of course, always comes with the caveat of check your browser support, but check this out. We're sitting at 87% already. It has not been out very long, and it is this is one of those like game changers in what it allows you to do. And it's already really high. We're waiting on Firefox to finally get around to supporting things, because as we can see here, it is just behind a flag in Firefox. And once they finally do get their implementation set and it's in the production version of it, it's just going to be a matter of time as people get onto the newer versions of the evergreen browsers. And of course, the one caveat, as usual, will be people on older iOS devices and older devices that just can't update. That's always going to be sort of the limiting factor in the browser support for a lot of these things. Next up is container queries, which is the next one that is a huge game changer, which is also at 87%. Is that the same as has? It is. I mean, they're basically the same. They came out around the same time, and that's just incredible. And if you don't know about container queries, it's like a media query, but it's for looking at the container size, the parent size, rather than looking at the viewport size. And it's just so much more useful and will completely change, especially in a world today where we're so focused on components, and now you can really scope your component styling based on the parent that it's in instead of having to worry about viewports. It's a really sort of logical way to work, and super nice. There is one thing you will notice here with container queries. If you look them up, container queries is the first thing that comes up is style queries. Style queries are a little bit different, that instead of the size of the parent, it's going to be based on, does the parent have this style? It could be like, is the background this value? Yes, then I want these styles. So you can style something based not just on the size of something, but eventually we'll also get to where you can style things based on the styles of what it's inside of, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, we're getting there. But container queries now, definitely something you can experiment with, play with, and potentially use in production. Once again, we'll get there in a little bit. Another one that I've been using a lot lately, which people don't mention too much about the browser support, surprisingly, compared to has anyway, which is also sitting at this 87, almost 88% range, is these the dynamic viewport heights. I looked up D, so it's the dynamic viewport height. This is also like SVH for the small viewport height and the LVH for large viewport height. And these are a lot like your viewport width, your viewport height, and all of that. But the difference is it takes into account the UI elements on, say, your phone. So I know people with VH always get annoyed on iOS because it causes problems sometimes. And this accounts for like the address bar that moves in and out. So the viewport height adjusts, that's your DVH. The SVH is also really useful, where it's just always assuming that those UI elements are in there. So some useful things that we can probably start playing with these days. There's also the media query range syntax that I've talked about. It's a little bit, let's just zoom in so we can see it a little bit clearer, because it's pretty obvious how it works. I'm super excited about it. This is definitely on the lower, we're hitting 80% now. It's not fantastic, but it's one of those things that I think in the short term, like once browser support hits a certain point on here, it's just going to explode, because it's such a better way of writing things and a lot clearer what's actually happening. So I've started using them in demos sometimes, and I think there's something that we'll see more and more of over time. And the next up is definitely, this one doesn't have better browser support than you think, but it will very soon, with just Subgrid. And that's because Chrome, or I should say Chromium team is actively working on it, because Microsoft is a big part of the team that's working on it. So we're sitting at only 18% now, but as soon as Chromium does get support for it, that's going to explode, considering most people don't use Chrome. And you saw that when it was like 60% browser support. And that was like with the style queries that were 60% when it was only Chrome that was supporting it. And that's newer versions of it. So yeah, once Chrome gets Subgrid, this number is going to skyrocket. And it's being actively worked on. I don't know when it's going to happen, but I do think it's going to be a lot sooner than we're maybe expecting it to, even though Firefox has I'm never going to get over this. Firefox has had it since 2019. So just saying, I'm happy Chrome's working on it. I'm happy Safari has support for it, but come on, guys, come on. But I do want to wrap this up where we're going to look at this other feature, which is floats. CSS property of float with 96% as well. Flexbox has better support than float. That doesn't make any sense. And that's a little bit of the highlight. I want to use this to highlight a little bit of the issue with can I use when you're looking at these browser support tables. And for some of this, the big caveat is actually Opera Mini that does hold browser support back. And it's also some of these other ones where it's these unknown ranges, even though like global is at 0% for some of these. But you're going to see some where it's giving us either unknown or unsupported. And especially with Opera Mini, where you're close to 1% support there. And some people go with like a 99.5% support range for when something is considered like actually usable in production, because they have a very big market. They want to make sure that everybody who's getting it is getting something functional. And with Opera Mini being at almost 1% of the users, that throws things off, and part of it is incomplete data. So here we can see that it's just saying unknown for float, which I'm going to assume Opera Mini supports. And then if we do look at some of these other features where it says Opera Mini supports Flexbox, but if we go and look at Grid, it's saying that it's unsupported here. And there's a lot of features you might see that Opera Mini is saying are unsupported. And it's not just Opera Mini, but we're going to focus on that one very quickly. And the problem with that is Opera Mini actually has like a full range of browsers. It can be a fully functional browser, but it's also like a feature phone browser. And it depends a little bit on the data settings people are using as well. Because you could have Opera Mini on your phone now and it's a fully functional browser, or you can, and I've played with this, you can turn on like the extreme saver mode and it's actually not loading the site on your own phone. It's loading it on their servers and serving it up to you that way. And it really reduces a lot of what's going on, and it's a much basic and more pared down browser. And this browser support table doesn't take into account what version of Opera Mini people are using. It might be the fully featured browser, or it might be the completely stripped down one that doesn't actually support Grid, but we don't have the number breakdown of that here. And the other thing is, I'm just looking at global numbers here, and I've sort of said this along the way of looking and seeing what your audience is actually using, because maybe I have an audience that is on really old iOS devices for some reason. Or if you're working in the medical field, you're probably dealing with PCs that are still running Windows XP and are on IE 10, and you do have to support that. And that's just the reality of things. So whereas me personally, if I'm putting a site together now, I'm not worried about Internet Explorer at all. And for many, many things, we don't need to worry about Internet Explorer anymore. But it really does depend on your audience and how many people are visiting your page. And then the other thing to take into account is what happens if the feature doesn't work. Does it break the experience, or is it just a small progressive enhancement that you're using? If I wanted to use Subgrid, it's very possible that Subgrid, if it's not working, breaks the user experience because the entire layout just falls apart. So it's probably not the best thing to be using right now. Or if I use the where pseudo class and that doesn't work and my entire selector just is considered invalid by the browser, and then that could completely break the layout, and that could be problematic. Whereas, and this is a really simple example, and if we go back to this example that I put together here, if fit content isn't supported, and all that happens is when the user goes on the page, it looks like this instead of looking like that, that really doesn't matter. This is one of those things where, yeah, it's looking a little bit nicer. It's more of how I wanted it to be or the designer wanted it to be. But if it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. And you have to think about things like that as well. Is this something that must look a very specific way where it breaks the user experience? Or is this just a nice to have type feature that improves things? And so maybe you can use something that has bad browser support, like text wrap balance, which is really, really cool, and probably has text wrap balance, which I think is only supported in Chrome right now. And what that means is when the lines break, we can see that if I turn that off, that line that's down there will go all the way over with one word here. And if not, then it wraps and it balances the line out to be a little bit nicer. And this is really cool, and it's a nice little progressive enhancement that I can add that while it has very bad browser support now, that's fine. As more people get onto browsers that do support it, and as more browsers do support it, more and more people will get the nicer experience. And another option is this project here by Stephanie Eccles that she recently put out called SupportsCSS. And it's a bit of a new take on the old modernizer, where this uses in-browser detection for the support of different selectors and features and at rules and everything. And what it will do is add classes to the HTML element. And so what this does is it's another approach. Instead of using @supports, you could use that extra class that's being added to target the browsers where that feature that you want to use is actually supported. And then so it could be another way to separate your concerns of like, this is on an older one and this is on the newer browser. And so this could be a really nice approach where you're targeting things based on, is that class there or not? And then you could be adding in your rules like that. And it also allows for custom tests and a lot more. So I definitely would recommend checking it out because it could be a really good solution as well. Now this I have not covered in any video yet, but @supports I have looked at. So if you'd like to see that one, you can check it out right here. And with that, I would like to thank my enablers of awesome, Andrew, James, Enrico, Michael, Simon, Tim, and Johnny, as well as all my other patrons for their monthly support. And of course, until next time, don't forget to make your corner of the internet just a little bit more awesome.